Chapter 26. Enter the Pactmasters. Yet things were not that simple. As it turned out, the Pactmasters were denizens of Leng themselves, and unbeknowingly the party had contacted some of them for the whole flesh-spawn business. So, as tempted to act as they were, they had the conflicting issue of facing the STC and potentially missing out on the deal to have a permanent and stable body for themselves. That is why 3 Pactmasters presented themselves to the party with a deal. They would not take any action against them, though they would have to intervene to fix the Katapeshi economy, in exchange for not just the bodies but the compromise that no other denizen within Galarian would be granted such treatment. They secretly planned to deal with the foreign denizen that had already arrived once the issue was sorted out. The Pactmasters each had an emerald of power that gave them control over hundreds of Illum, special types of brass golems that guarded the palaces, vaults, and markets of Katapesh, dozens of which they had left hidden outside Saltspit should push come to shove. So it shouldn't be too problematic now that they knew who he was. As much as they were kinsmen, they were all too well aware that having any other denizen achieve such a feat would be problematic for their own plans. And if anything, holding such treasure in their power would grant them unimaginable influence far beyond the reaches of Katapesh. The idea was simply too tempting. Of the whole party, Valinar was the only one who had a reasonable measure of just how powerful denizens were, and to him the deal seemed reasonable given the current circumstances. Hassan, however, was not. He knew they were powerful and influential, but just wasn't going to hand over his only bargaining chip. So after sending the prince into comfy incarceration and dispatching the denizens to their respective rooms while they discussed the situation, he devised a plan. Once he talked it out with the party, it was time to set it into motion. At sunset, Volgok came to pick up the denizens and guide them through the underground passages of the laboratories. There, a group of apothecaries awaited next to the vats where some previously selected flesh spawns had been placed. In silence, the denizens inspected the vessels, doing all sorts of nefarious and inscrutable planning within their alien minds. Suddenly, one of the denizens, the one who wasn't a Pactmaster, makes an advance to try and get a hold of one of the spawns. These creatures have an unusual connection to each other that dates back to the times before their own multiverse collapsed, and they were all keenly aware of the constant telepathic prodding they were each trying to use on the rest in order to know what they were thinking. However, after thousands of years of depredating on each other, it didn't take a scion to know what was going to happen. And this particular denizen understood full well the disadvantage at which he was against the Pactmasters. This led to a pretty heated battle between the denizens, during which the apothecaries got killed and most of the laboratory trashed. At one point the denizens abandoned their facades and went full-on abomination, fleshy tentacles and anemone mouths flashing all over the place. Volgok just allowed them to fight, waiting for the perfect moment to call on Hassan. And that moment came when the Pactmasters attempted in panic to switch into their flesh spawns after the lone denizen managed to take a hold of their minds during the short pause they had to make sure to activate their emeralds of power and call upon the dozens of Illum they had left parked out in the desert just outside Saltspit. The barbarian ran back, shut tight the heavy metal doors, trapping himself inside, mind you, and yelled at Hassan through the crystal ball he had brought with him. Above ground things were nasty. Hassan had ordered some workers to open the discharge canals they'd used to clean Slimy's pool, in order to have the water current push the insane aboleth through the aqueduct, which also connected to the flesh labs. Valinar had gathered all the spellcasters he could that had even the slightest capabilities to fend off insanity, and they all rushed to the operation. Problem was that Slimy didn't fit, so they had to start demolishing the whole thing, which was taking too long, until one of the workers had the genius idea to use an explosive discharge on the base of the aqueduct. This would have been great, if not for the fact that it ended with Slimy on his back splattered on the sand, with the lab still a good way ahead. Despite Valinar's spellcasting squad's best efforts, workers were already bleeding through their ears and trying to pull their own heads off with a shovel. Slimy wasn't going anywhere. "Portals! We need to use portals!" shouted Hassan to no one in particular.
"I have a few at hand, but I cannot teleport anything with safety unless I'm well aware of where I'm aiming,"
answered Valinar. He asked me if he could try to teleport to the lab, but since he had not been there in a while, I couldn't ensure him a high chance of success. Plus, he remembered the angry denizens inside and quickly decided the option was not in his best interests. That's when Vorgog's voice came through the crystal ball.
Hey, Prince! What about you stop making excuses and use that damn glass thing?
He sounded like he was wrestling monsters down there, which he pretty much was. Valanar and Hassan exchanged looks for a moment, during which a tiny hint of guilt was briefly perceived before the priest broke out a scroll and asked one of the surviving arcane spellcasters to use it on Slimy and aim through the crystal ball to get the precise destination. And with a path of mystical energies, the aboleth was gone. The screaming, the voices, and worse yet the images that came through the crystal ball were so horrible that the mage dropped it and shattered it into 1,000 pieces. But he did manage to see Slimy appearing next to Vorgok and insanity becoming almost palpable down there. In the labs, Vorgok entered rage in order to fend off insanity, while the denizens, still locked in battle and fighting to get the last remaining flesh spawns, went bananas. It is true that, back in the day, the party had managed to survive a long trip next to Slimy. However, quite a while had passed since then, allowing Slimy's ravaged mind to coalesce into the stuff of pure horror, feeding off the madness that turned the minds of the bunkhouse prisoners into vanilla pudding. Also, when you're an interdimensional being of countless years, you have truly prime crafting material for nightmares in your head. Eventually, the denizens got themselves trapped in the flesh spawns, shaking in mental agony as Vorgog finished recreating WrestleMania on their original bodies. His rage rounds were running out. In Pathfinder, rather than having a specific number of uses of rage, the barbarian class gets a certain number of rounds he can spend enraged each day. So the Ulfin hurried up, took the spawns off their vats and put them inside a metal box and ran away from the lab before Slimy could do his thing on him. Weak and unfinished as the spawns were, the denizens managed to get themselves locked in pretty much useless bodies, while the nightmare fits made their mental capacity was occupied elsewhere. Vorgok ran to the deepest pits of the tunnel network which connected with the original dungeon that used to stand there, making his way around the place until he found the leftovers of an old trap puzzle they had encountered the first time they visited the place oh so many sessions ago, which consisted of some stone sarcophagi with hidden pits, magical darkness, and guarded by mummies. Went to one of the coffins with the hidden pits while dancing around now much less menacing local undead, hurled the box to the bottom along with all the mummies he could find in the place, and shut it closed with several dozen stone slabs, just before collapsing the room's pillars and running away. Things eventually calmed down. Most of the workers and spellcasters Valanar and Hassan brought with them had gone mad, but a quick call to the Night Hag solved that problem, and at the same time increased the available nightmare pots. Some unlucky NPCs who hadn't gone mad were taken too. Vorgok refused to explain where he had sent the spawns, arguing everyone's safety, but insisted they were securely trapped. Besides some deep cuts, tentacle marks, and a broken arm, he was in good shape. The next few days were mostly devoted to taking Slimy out of the labs and sending him back to his pool. With the facility trashed and all those involved in the works dead, the party decided to close up this business venture. The surviving elves were sold to Alsher and Gen after Vorgok had had his way with them, and everything else was torched and the place collapsed. The whole deal was proving to be far too risky and problematic, particularly now they had far better and more reliable sources of profit. Chapter 27. So we meet again. When they were taking out the elves, however, Jack stumbled upon the Emeralds of Power originally carried by the denizens, and decided to include them into his bling repertoire. Hassan took them from him about 10 minutes later. He had recognized them as quickly as he saw them. The party had dealt with one in the second or third session of the campaign back when they were still slaves, and he had already heard the report about the considerable amount of Illum that were waiting amidst the sands just a few miles out of town. Probably brought there by the Pactmasters who, seemingly, planned on getting their request fulfilled whether the STC wanted it or not. After leaving some trusted advisors in charge of finishing up and organizing the reconstruction of the aqueducts, the party travelled to the outskirts of Saltspit. Using the flying carpet to get a better view, initially they were hard to find, brass against scalding sands and all that, but after some inspection, they found themselves floating above a legion of Illum. A quick count put the number at around 60. Valanar was speechless. instant golem army, was all he could muster. Raheem's player arrived that same session. He had been working on his character sheet to include the recent changes he had gone through. He was already quite thrilled to play a mutant gorilla monk, truth be told, and now that things had calmed down, we took the time to bring him back into the game. The party returned to the STC HQ. Hassan and Jack went to meet up with the prince to shake him up a bit and have him reveal how to properly use the Emeralds of Power. Vorgok went to the Pit of Prostitutes to check on the new wenching corporations, the Salt Spit. And Valenar headed down into the dungeons to check on Raheem, and he found him reading a treatise on wood carving. "Ah, we meet again, Valenar." The priest was a bit startled by the image, a hulking purple-haired gorilla with clever eyes, sporting a pair of minuscule glasses and instructing himself in the art of carving wood. He seemed both immensely peaceful and thoughtful. Raheem made a gesture to stand, and still nervous, Valenar attempted to control him through the brass rune. The monk gave a short pause and then proceeded, tapping his forehead. "I know what you did to me, Valenar, and what you can do. But as long as I keep my mind clear enough, I can fight it." Valenar regarded him with distrust. "Then why are you not tearing down these walls and choking me to death?" "Because I already tried that, and look where it got me." He regarded the priest with a bright gorilla smile. "I betrayed my vows and gave in to wild emotion. I forgot all I was taught, and the punishment for that was this." He scratched his head. "Perhaps it is a good opportunity to start over." "What about Falbala? She is dead, you know. It was horrible, bloody. The spawn, your son, ate her from the inside out." Raheem tensed for a moment, then relaxed, after some appropriate will rolls, of course. "Terrible indeed. But I have to put it behind, shall I ever get back to the way of self-improvement. Do not think of it as me forgiving you. I could never do such a thing. Think of it as me taking back control over myself." He leaned closer to the bars. "Now the door, if you would." I was pretty happy by how Raheem's player had handled the whole situation, as it gave me a route with which to get the party working together again, something I was having trouble figuring out considering all that happened. So I allowed him to resist Valnar's control as long as he managed to maintain his mind clear and emotions out of the way, as his character ought to do from the start according to his own background. Noticeably shaking, Valenar took a while to take the step and open Raheem's cage. The gorilla would have had no problems opening it himself anyway.